Hello, and welcome to Constellation Interviews for our upcoming conference in Virginia Beach, October 5th to 8th, the North American Systemic Constellations Conference we give every 2 years, and you can find out more information at our website, nasconstellations.org. And today I have a very interesting opportunity with two of our presenters, Cheney and Cilla Utne. Exploring ethnocentric belonging. Welcome. This is going to be very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you, Linda.
Oh, so happy to meet you guys and talk about this. So this sounds like a super exciting topic. Tell me, how did you come to talk about ethnocentric belonging?
Well, I would start with, I went to the Winter Gathering, which is a social change network, essentially, that invites speakers from all around the country here in Whidbey Island. And Milton Bennett, who is a big influence in let's say formulating this whole idea, is a friend, and Cilla studied with him. At that conference, it became clear to me that it would be a really interesting usage of constellations to constellate how we belong. Let's say the obvious part in family constellations, how we belong to our family, but then how do we belong to the culture, and how does that influence us? And with the current state in this country in terms of the strong polarities that we're facing and the strong belief systems, whether on the left or the right, it just seems to me that this would be utilizing Dr. Bennett's kind of model would be an interesting thing to constellate. And so from that point on, started working with that idea.
So, yes. So, thank you, John. And so I just, to back up a little bit on Milton's research, he did this back in the 80s, and he developed a model called the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. And what that is looking at, if you break it down, is basically 6 levels of consciousness. So he has specifically studied cultures, so how a person, so an individual or collective, is moving from an ethnocentric worldview to what he refers to an ethno-relative worldview. And there are 3 ethnocentric stages and 3 ethno-relative stages. And an ethnocentric, just to define that briefly, it really means so one's own worldview feels subconsciously superior to somebody else's worldview. So we're basically judging other people and their experience and their behavior by the standard of mine. And we have a subconscious sense that if those people only knew how to do it my way, they would. Mm-hmm. And so what Milton developed, and which he, of course, he did his doctorate in this, and I studied with him. I was in the intercultural training field for 15 years, and a rather cognitive framework that we're now bringing in to sort of superimpose onto constellation, I think will be a very interesting marriage in using this model as sort of listening posts for how we set it up. And that's what we're kind of going to explore in it. But the essence is that there is a feeling associated with each of these stages. So if, and the stages, we're going to go into them a little bit more in depth in the session, but moves from denial of a difference to defense, and then minimization of difference, which basically a lot of people that I have observed, both in the corporate world and, for lack of a better term, kind of the Save the World movement, get a little bit stuck in the minimization phase, which is where we say that all humans are the same. We are one world after all, and tolerance is kind of where we get to in that stage. And that's great, but it doesn't move us beyond a point where we can actually accept and adapt to somebody else's worldview and belief in a grounded and integrated way. So that's a little bit what we're going to feel into and explore, and looking at bringing it back home to American soil here. The polarity and polarization that we're experiencing in this country right now is in essence an intercultural consciousness issue. So we're going to take that to the metaverse. We're not going to care so much about anger or what I feel about one or the other issue or one or the other side, liberal or conservative, but we're going to look at it at the polarization itself and actually how destructive that can be to a society to do that. So
yeah, we feel. Excuse me, go ahead.
Go ahead, Linda.
No, I was just going to say, excellent. This is really nice because it's really fits in well with our theme, Bridging the Divide, Healing the Personal Collective Soul. So who should come to the workshop?
Well, I think people that are interested in social change, looking to become aware of the dynamics. I think this is it's eloquently described in a way that I think sometimes with constellation work, the intellectual side is maybe a little bit glossed over, and I think I've always been more intuitive with the work, but I also find it's helpful in terms of, I don't want to say placating the mind, but giving the mind a place. And, as, let's say, we are able to refine our thinking about a subject matter, then, and we become clear, the mind becomes clear about what it's perceiving. And let's say, if I'm caught up in denial, or if I move to some level of acceptance, if we can kind of see this, then we have less of a tendency of falling back into, let's say, places that we've been before. And I think we've seen that, in the trauma studies in Constellation, where we may feel like sometimes we go back to different states of trauma. And the more we're aware in those moments, the more we can kind of come back to our sense of fullness. So that's where I always feel like, with my work with 5 elements, it gives a place for the mind, it gives a place for the heart, and the balance between the two, and how the mind can serve the heart from the sense of, let's say, when a mind's running out of control, can we slow that back down so we can come back to our feeling? And that's where I feel like the mind can serve. And this construct that Dr. Bennett has developed, I think is helpful. Just giving a schematic similar to the 5 elements to see kind of where we are.
Yeah. And that's so nice that you said that, the mind and the heart. I actually, myself, I have for about 6 or 7 years, I've been wearing every day this, it's a heart and a brain necklace. And it's really to remind myself, when I was very stuck in my mind back like 10 years ago, when I was very corporate, I had short hair, I was wearing a suit, going to work. And to remind myself to be more in my heart. And I would say that that was one of the aspects of the work, not to this corporate work, but that I felt that there was a lack of heart, and that the work that I did and the trainings that I did, while they were, effective and people were helped by them, it was somewhat superficial. And when I found Constellation, and John has been in Constellation work a lot longer than I have, I've been in it for about 5 years, and went through the facilitator training just last year with Francesca Mason-Boring here in Seattle. And And that's where John and I met. And when I found constellation work and went through that journey myself and realizing, why do I do the things that I do in life? Why was I drawn to intercultural training work? Well, lo and behold, my own family history, with my mother born in the Soviet Union, moving to Finland and to Sweden and had a ton of trauma in her first 6 years of her childhood, and then closed the door on that story that then lived on in me. And I didn't find that type of healing for that particular trauma until I found Constellation. And then everything sort of fell into place on top of the intercultural work that I'd been doing. So it made a lot of sense. And I think it made a lot of sense to bring those two fields together. John and I are actually presenting at an intercultural conference also this fall at the CIATAR conference in San Diego, which is the Society for Intercultural Education, Training, and Research, which is a very similar type of group of people, but it's coming in from the intercultural lens as opposed to the constellation lens. So we're going to bring family constellation to that conference.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, that's very exciting. And somebody's approving your kitty.
Yes, exactly. That's Ollie.
Cheering us on.
Oh, this is very exciting. So anything to add? Because I can see now you're going to be very busy with your workshop. It's going to be well attended for especially those of us that like to do collective work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I would welcome anybody who feels that they are a little bit stuck right now with our political climate and that you sort of can't see your way out of it. I would also welcome anybody who has experience with, immigration stories, of course. That's always, we all have that story somewhere in us. But to be able to compare and contrast cultural differences too. Like, I have lived in 7 different cultures in the world, and it's easier for us, I think, as humans to readily accept, for example, me as a Swedish person, I was born and raised in Sweden. I can see that there's a difference, cultural difference in values with somebody who's from, say, Japan. Whereas when we come home and we have differences among us in our own culture, we tend to think that those other people just need to come back to this side and think like I do, because aren't we all the same? And to recognize that we have those differences within our own country here in America, I think is crucial to be able to bridge and move forward in a different way, regardless of what side of the issue you're on and what you're agreeing and your preferences are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been fascinating with the work that we've already done to see the polarization characterized in the constellation, and just how you can see that it's in a way that polarization is the place that we share with, let's say, the person who's on the other side of that polarization. It's a feeling, we could call it a feeling of disconnect. Yet I always, my years of constellation work, I see that the disconnect is really the connection. And it's a feeling that that both sides are actually feeling at the same time. But the finger of blame oftentimes goes across that boundary, and that you're the reason. Yet healing that, and you could say there's numerous cultural traumas, just like what Cilla was speaking of in her own family of origin. You know, this country is a country of immigrants, and what's happened, you know, we've all heard those stories, and how do they currently impact us, let alone culturally what's happening in terms of the information that we receive. If I'm focused on, let's say, I only listen to liberal information, and so my mind is then thinking on those terms, And then if I am confronted with somebody who is only getting information from the right, we'll see that we both have different worldviews. And what we've seen so far in the work that we've done is that there's the commonality that brought the two polarities together is that we both have a story. And that, and yet that's only arriving at the stage of minimization. And if that's all we can get to, that's as far as we can go in the current, let's say, situation that we find these United States in. And it feels like it's a very volatile time. And yet if we can begin to see each other, and that's what I've taken from this work, is that can I stand in my own feeling and be clear and see the other, of course, as a human being, and not judged by the information. It's because it's just information. And what is it a true reflection of what is really happening? Can you say anything about that in terms of what Milton was speaking about in terms of Newtonian? Einstein's thinking, and how that's influenced, because it's. I mean, I could, but please.
So Milton Bennett, he speaks often about in his talks about reality and culture. He says that reality is not a thing, or culture is not a thing, and what tends to happen in these times when we go for the information that supports our worldview, what then happens is we dig our heels deeper into that worldview, and then we not only do we stick to it, we objectify the other, and they are inherently wrong. We are right and they are wrong, and the two shall never meet, right? And that's the old sort of Newtonian objectifying of the other. And you are my problem. If you cannot change and be like my worldview, then we will all be happy. What we don't recognize in that situation is that, I don't know if you've heard that story or what, the blind man that feeling the elephant, it's like we've sort of, it's a confusion there with the Einsteinians, like because it's all relative. We don't recognize the elephant. We don't recognize the elephant. We only recognize the part that we're touching, and that now have become the correct part of the elephant that we're touching. Is, I think, what Milton said in one of his talks. And I like that analogy because it helps us to understand that we need to, so basically what we need to do is we need to step back to see the elephant. And I would say that has become next to impossible in the climate that we're in America, to see the whole elephant. Wouldn't it be interesting if we could? So that's kind of where I think we can maybe leave it at that for now, and then we will take in, and we're not even going to go into perhaps the ethno-relative stages of this model, because as the name suggests, we're going to explore ethnocentric belonging. And we're not necessarily saying that ethnocentric belonging is where it's at. We're just going to explore it. And the three phases of what does it mean to be in denial of somebody else's worldview? What does it mean to be in defense of your own worldview? And what does it mean to move to minimization, where we say we're all the same, but recognizing that is still in an ethnocentric worldview, thinking that, we're never going to be able to accept and adapt to somebody else's. So that's what we're gonna do.
But the constellation, I think that technology, so to speak, is really helpful to be able to see this polarization. So it's like, if we use the analogy again of the elephant, we can begin to see kind of the elephant. And my sense of entanglement, my own kind of personal definition when I'm in situations in the world is if I'm unaware of, let's say, I'm plugging into a business system that I've never been involved in, a company. And so I think of it in terms of systems and how that's impacting me in the moment. Am I feeling emotions that belong to me or that don't belong to me? And are there aggressions, or there, let's say, a feeling of ease here? And this came about, I think, through my teaching piano, and when I would go into 36 homes a week, and each home would be different, and I'd go, this would be a really nice creative flow here. No creative flow, feel like I'm being strangled, so on and so forth. So this was kind of my education by fire. And so when we look at how these, that clearly I was entangled in these family systems, yet we can't help but be involved with whatever system we're plugging into. So what I see really helpful with this polarization is, can I be aware of how I'm being impacted, and be clear about that, and make the choice not to unconsciously act out, let's say, the anger, or and we know anger is a secondary emotion, and that underneath it is, in this case, probably more often than not, fear. But then there can be also grief underneath that. And can I be clear in these situations where I'm engaged with somebody, I would say, who's maybe politically different than me, and still be in my humanness and open to it? And that's where I see the value of what we're aiming for with this session, is to help people, let's say, find themselves, also be fully resourced, so to speak, so that they're not entangled in, it's a big issue. It's way bigger than any of us. So it's something.
It is.
Yeah, it's huge. It's our entire culture. Yeah. It's reflected in the world. And so we need to look at what little piece we can, let's say, take in and chew and begin to understand, and then allow ourselves to, let's say, what I would say the last piece here is a freedom of entanglement. Is, can we be aware of those dynamics that we're plugging into without being impacted?
Yeah, and I think one thing that John can offer at the end, because we have no idea where this is going to go when we set it up in this particular conference, depending on who arrives and what the feelings are with people that arrive, and we'll be very conscientious of that. But one thing that I think would be important to take some time at the end is for maybe all of us to do a 5-element sort of balancing constellation that will kind of take us out of the whatever space we've been in, so that we can all leave that session feeling resourced and going into whatever we need to go into next, because it is a big topic, and we're not aiming to resolve anything in 90 minutes, but we're going to explore it and see what happens.
Right. Yes. Well, thank you very much for your time today. This sounds very interesting. You guys might have to do a second session in open space to follow up or something. I'm sure a lot of people will be very interested in this. Thanks again.
Thank you, Linda.
Thank you, Linda.
Okay. And for more information about John and Cilla's workshop, Exploring Ethnocentric Belonging, see our website, nasconstellations.org. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Take care. Thanks, Cilla and John. Take care. We'll see you at the conference. Okay.
There. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.